Thank you, Adriana. I'm very happy to be here. The distance is a little unsettling, but I'm happy some people dare to sit nearer. Also, if I break into uncontrollable cough, it's nothing to do with you, so it actually is probably a good thing that you're sitting far away. As I hope is obvious, my title, Race, Nation, Religion, is a citation. I think every single one of my title is Race, Nation, Class, Balibar and Wallerstein. The connection between those three terms, race, nation, and class, has been somehow more seriously established. The relation or lack of relation between race, nation, and religion is not so. As the abstract that I had sent ahead tried to explain, race could be seen as a perversion of nation. Yes, the proper nationalism should not degenerate into racism. Race and class, obviously, as Balibar and Wallerstein have argued, are of course connected. Foucault made a similar argument that the war of classes ended up leading to the war of races. Although with Foucault, as with many, race and racism is often seen as in fact a kind of return of some archaic antagonism, which is articulated around the concept of race. And religion, for the most part, is seen as also as even more archaic. Yes, human beings have always had religion, with a kind of parenthesis which should have led us all into some kind of heavenly state of progress where religion disappeared, with the surprise that occurred in the late 70s and 80s in most places, with different at different speed depending on the place, with the so-called return of religion. As I assume many of you know, religion never really went away, but its distinction from race, a distinction that enables a discourse of, the gentle word is secularism, but the less gentle word is anti-religious. In fact, in most of its forms, in Europe and in the United States, outrightly Islamophobic. Yes, the one religion that is that it is okay to be opposed to the most is, of course, Islam. But Islamophobia is not racism. One is not a racist toward a religion. To be against religion is simply to be enlightened. And it's the history of those disconnection. Yes. If I'm anti-religious, I am not racist. If I look at the history of race, I am looking at something distinct from the history of religion. Sorry, I didn't give an illustration for that particular one, but probably one of the most famous one is Hannah Arendt's argument that what used to be theological anti-Judaism became, with modernity, with secular modernity, biological, scientific racism. Yes, so the hatred of the Jews, which used to have a theological base, is basically no longer relevant if one wants to understand what happens in secular modernity. And the emergence of biological racism, of scientific racism, is a testament to this. One of the persistent forms of that particular prejudice is found in the kind of disconnect there is between Nazism and Christianity. You may know that in the body of scholarship on Nazism, if there is a religion, if there is a religious set of institutions that are connected with Nazism, for the most part in a slightly surprising manner. For anyone who knows something about Germany, in a slightly surprising manner, it is the Catholic Church that is mostly identified with Nazi crime for its collaboration, which, by the way, is quite correct historically, but does not quite exhaust the relation between Nazism and Christianity as a whole. Not to mention, of course, that Germany is also the land of the Reformation, and that the connection between Protestantism and Nazism is something that has gathered much less attention in, again, a fairly surprising manner given the history of Germany. But what I'm puzzled by is, of course, not simply the empirical connections that one could make between race, nation, and religion, but rather that, since we know, after all, that the nation is a construct, as they say, it's not entirely clear always what it means, but certainly a form of collective existence that requires quite a large amount of effort. Yes, one needs to come to national consciousness, even if one has been a nation forever. National consciousness is something that one needs to struggle with, in the same way, by the way, that race is something that may be granted in its biology, if one likes, but even racial consciousness, as Hitler, in fact, himself, not necessarily the greatest of theorists, but not a minor figure when it comes to race discourse. Hitler himself was quite aware of the fact that the race consciousness of the Germans was not something that could be taken for granted. Yes, this is actually something that Hannah Arendt pointed out that is not taken into consideration sufficiently, namely that Hitler was very aware of the fact that the master race was not exactly a given. It needed to be produced. It needed to be brought about. Hence the eugenics programs, hence the enduring selection to which Germans themselves were subjected. I suppose the empirical history that interests me is the fact that the three terms, race, nation, and religion, come about roughly between in their form and in their conceptual existence, come about in fact only in the 16, 17, 18, and of course fully formed in the 19th century. The three concepts, race, nation, and religion, are the effect of a discourse that we know well from, say, Edward Said's Orientalism, but by way of discipline, really the discipline of philology. The coming about of this science, which separates groups according to the language that they speak, the language that they speak being as well the thought that they are able to think. Yes, the language that you speak is in fact testimony to the way you think. That is one of the grounds of philology, which then turns, in a way that is not completely arbitrary, into a racial discourse. If the way you speak testifies to the way you think testifies to the way you are, and the three end up being connected. You can only think the way you do because you are what you are. Therefore, you can only speak the way you do. And the hierarchies of languages are made in a very scientific manner. Another thing to remember is that racism was not simply bad science, it was simply the science of the day. So philology as the science which ultimately separates or divides itself into history, into linguistics, into anthropology, into literary studies. Philology is really at the basis of the conceptual use of those three terms: race, nation, religion. Now, when it comes to the separation of those terms, which again emerge from the very same discourse, and I'll give you an example immediately, of the way in which both are connected in their disconnection, nation and religion. The debate over the emancipation of the Jews in the late 18th and early 19th century, which happens to be, by the way, the moment when Semites are invented, the distinction between Aryans and Semites, is invented at the same moment, in the same circles, by the same intellectuals, the same thinkers and scholars, translators, etc. The debate over the Jewish question and over the emancipation of the Jews is articulated as follows. Either the Jews can be transformed, yes, either they can be transformed and become citizens, enlightened citizens, like us Christians, or us secular individuals, secular citizens. Either the Jews can become like us, which means that they are able to transform, able to change, which means that their Jewishness, their Judaism, is in fact something that does not hinder them. It is, as it were, a matter of choice. It is something that is not fixed, something that can change. That thing that can change, we call religion. So if the Jews can become citizens, it is because they can change, which means that their religion, that which makes them Jews, is not something that prevents them from changing. It is something that they can put aside, just like we Christians put aside our religion as we think of our status as citizen, as secular citizens. We don't have to be non-religious to be citizens, but our religion should not become part of the public sphere. Yes, these are debates that are continuing to this very day here in the United States, even in France, which appears to not have achieved the laïcité, the secularism that it thought. The alternative, yes, was that the Jews were not able to transform. They were not able to change. If they were not, it meant that their Jewishness, their Judaism, was something that prevented them from changing. In which case, Judaism was not to be understood as a religion, but, and this is the term that is used at that moment, the Jews are what they in fact said they are. They call themselves a nation, and they are one. It's not quite yet the nation that we are familiar with from the nationalist discourse, but simply from the fact that people are what they are, in a way that exceeds a somehow narrow definition of religion. If the Jews are a nation, first of all, you can see how in France, for example, with the French Revolution, the discourse of emancipation might turn out to be a problem. We are the French nation, we are coming about making ourselves through this revolution. It turns out there's another nation in our midst. Clearly, that is not going to go well in a nation state, in an emerging nation state. If they are a nation, at any rate, it means that they cannot change. They are what they are. And the only option then becomes either to expel them, because there cannot be a nation within a nation, or, as some German philologists suggested, exterminate them, which again has some logic to it, not necessarily the one that we want to embrace, but you can understand that if Jews cannot change, if they cannot be, if they cannot evolve, if they cannot become citizens like us, then they are a danger. So you can see how the discourse of nation versus religion is already a way of first deciding what Judaism really is in a kind of scientific manner, but also a way of distinguishing between two categories that are, as it were, inherent to the object. Either the Jews are a nation or they are a religion. So far, we didn't know, we didn't need to ask ourselves the question maybe. Now that we do, now that we ourselves are a nation, we need to raise the question and decide what to do with the Jews on that basis. The emancipation, for the most part, both in Germany and in France and in England, decided that the Jews were a confession, a religion. They took different names. In German, they became citizens of the Mosaic confession. I'm going to return to Moses in a second. Of the Mosaic confession, in France, they became Israelite, right? As in the ancient Hebrews. But of course, the discourse according to which they were a nation, and later, in fact, the embodiment of a collective that cannot change, yes, that term, as you know, is the term, to designate that, is the term race. One of the most, to my mind, interesting statements that Hitler in fact made in Mein Kampf is precisely that the Jews managed to convince the world that they are a religion when they are in fact a race. So not only is the distinction between race and religion well established, but their connection is almost one of screen versus essence, right? Appearance versus essence, deception versus truth. Now, another moment, I referred earlier to the invention of the Semite, another moment where the term race and religion are connected in an interesting way is that the separation between Aryans and Semites, articulated in the most, in the clearest manner by the French intellectual French philologist Ernest Renan, who is quite an important figure, obviously in Edward Said's Orientalism, but in fact in French intellectual life can probably be called one of the greatest French intellectuals. Again, not necessarily a very commendable figure, but certainly a popular one and influencing one in France in the 19th century. Renan, who really sedimented the distinction between Aryans and Semite in the following terms. The Aryans have everything. They have mythology, art, politics, military, wisdom, science, everything. The Semites have nothing, except one thing which the Aryans didn't manage to get, namely how to unify this extraordinary creativity that is at work in all the fields that they are contributing to, innovating in, and generating. The one thing that Semites have is, in fact, the one God. Semites are this strange race which has no attribute of its own except for its kind of radical emptiness, which is only alleviated by its invention. Renan doesn't even want to give them the credit of invention. He says it's a kind of instinct. It's not like they actually are, clever or anything. It's just that in the desert, there's not, when there's no water and only sun, apparently there's only one thought that can come to mind, and it's the thought of the one God. You should try it sometime. Just go to the desert, see if it works. So Semites are the race which, in contradistinction to the superior race, the Aryan race that has all the, again, all the knowledge, all the culture, all the science, all the wisdom, but not an idea to unify all this. Semites have nothing of the sort. They are a race that is entirely empty except for the idea of the one God, which then can come to unify everything. One of the interesting kind of consequences of that particular idea that Renan had, but which was immensely popular, was the enigma as to how it could have been that a somehow well-known Semite could have actually come up with a religion which clearly was the culmination of human intelligence and creativity, namely Christianity. How is it that a Semite, namely Jesus, could come up with the genius that Christianity is? The answer was actually very easy. Those of you who know the geography of Palestine, Israel, may know that the south is very dry and somehow appears to be close to a desert, whereas the north, the region of Galilee, is very hilly and quite green. There's a lot of water. So if you actually think of those two regions, you can realize that one is the north, the other is the south. That's geographically true enough. What you may not have thought is that the north is Aryan, whereas the south is Semite, which of course, was true in other states and other countries. Clearly, Jesus was from Nazareth, which is in Galilee, and therefore he was an Aryan. Only an Aryan living among Semites could have come up with the genius that Christianity is, which is in fact the moment when Aryan civilization, in all its richness, could then be unified under the idea of the one God, which again is the culmination of civilization. So again, you can see how race and religion are connected, how they are connected in their separation. Yes, one is either one or the other, or one is in fact a divine genius who is able to bring the two together, bring the race that invented religion with the race that invented everything else together in this culmination that is Christianity. So far, so good. But what I really want to talk about with you is, of course, Moses, and most importantly, Freud's Moses. Because, as you may remember, and I hope you do, because it's an absolutely amazing book to read. If you haven't, you should. Moses and Monotheism, as the title indicates, is an inquiry into religion. Yes? That seems obvious enough. In fact, the German title of the book, Der Mann Mose und die monotheistische Religion, actually mentions religion explicitly. Some of the critics of the translation point out that to mention monotheism is not enough, that Freud was really calling attention to, in fact, the opposition between the man Moses and the monotheistic religion, between the human and the divine, as well as calling attention to religion as a problem. Now, it was not the first time, it was the last time, but it was not the first time that Freud tried to explain religion. But as Freud explains religion, one particular problem may emerge, namely that the earlier text where Freud engages in a similar endeavor is, of course, Totem and Taboo. But in Totem and Taboo, Freud is not simply trying to explain religion. He's actually trying to explain how does the human collective comes about. Yes? Another text where Freud does similar things is Civilization and its Discontent. So one of the issues with Moses and monotheism, or with the notion that the text comes to explain religion, is how particular to religion is the phenomenon whereby, as you remember from Totem and Taboo, whereby a collective kills a collective of brothers. This will not be a feminist lecture. The collective of brothers, I mean, there are women involved, but, you know, I'm not sure that's going to qualify as feminist. Over the fact that the father monopolizes the women, the brothers come together and decide to kill the father. And as you know, once the father is dead, his law, his rule becomes even more powerful. That law is in fact the law forbidding access to women, namely incest. Oh, not forbidding completely, but limiting access to women. So, as you can see, what is explained here is not the emergence of religion, it's actually the emergence of the human community. It's the emergence of law, it's the emergence of sociability, it's the emergence of something that looks different than basically a kind of pack of gorillas. Was that laughter? Or? No. So, in a similar way, by the way, when Freud describes the Oedipus complex, he is not accounting for one particular form of human development. He is claiming a universal claim, namely that we all need to, in fact, go through the phase where we want to sleep with our mother and kill our father. It works a little differently again for girls, but it's not so significant. The point is still that murder is at the origin. Murder intended or practice. Freud, as you remember, does not make a fundamental difference between the phantasmatic and the realized. The point is that murder is at the basis of human development, whether it is collective or individual. So how is it that the murder of Moses, I didn't ask whether you all know the story, as Freud tells it, basically Moses was an Egyptian. As an Egyptian, he was frustrated with the fact that this early form of monotheism that was advocated by one of the pharaohs had failed. Amenhotep IV had tried to establish the cult of the one God, the one sun God. It had not ended well. I mean, he had destroyed all kinds of Egyptian divinities, but it did not last. There was a kind of counter-revolution, and the cult of the one God was eradicated, except that, this is where Freud's argument comes in, with the help of a few philologists, except that Moses, who had been perhaps close to Amenhotep IV, otherwise known as Akhenaton, was who appears kind of in The Mummy, you know, the movie, the Hollywood movie, you know, textual references. Moses basically decided, since the Egyptian didn't go with monotheism, he decided to take a bunch of ruffians, people who had nothing better to do, and make them into a monotheistic people. He took those people who became the Jews and led them to the desert, which they didn't like. They certainly didn't like that he was imposing a new law on them, and they killed him. Which, if you've read the Bible, shouldn't come as a great surprise. It's not like the Israelites were, you know, constantly happy with Moses. They appear to have been quite angry with him on a regular basis. So, again, intention, action, not necessarily important. Freud, at any rate, claims that there was, it gets even better, there was a second Moses. The Israelites came to feel very guilty for the murder, and ultimately, as with the Oedipus complex, or as with Totem and Taboo, the murder ends up producing guilt. Guilt ends up producing identification. Identification means that one subjects oneself to the law of the dead. So, law, community, sexuality, collective history, it's not clear what that has to do with religion. Now, where it gets interesting is that the summary of this, right, which is the history of human development and of collective becoming, is always the same. A father is murdered, as a result of which a community comes about. Now, in Moses and Monotheism, Freud is clear that he is talking about the way Judaism came about as monotheistic, right, by way of a repression of a history of murder and of the holding on, in fact, to the act as repressed, which makes the attachment of the Jews, their, in fact, persistence through history, somehow more understandable. Yes, just like the sons are attached to the law of the father, even if the father is no longer here to enforce it. Now, Freud also makes something which, given the time at which the book is published, makes a lot of sense, but also because Freud says so explicitly, he's also interested in anti-Semitism. Now, there's about 10 pages toward the end of the book that are somehow seriously dealing with anti-Semitism, but it appears to be a somehow marginal issue. The point seems to be that because the Jews are, in fact, murderers, there is a kind of fear of them that gets produced because they are murderers who do not acknowledge the murder. In the context of a religion that does acknowledge murder, namely Christianity, yes, one of the basic principle of Christianity, of course, is that we are all guilty of the murder of Christ. He died for our sins, yes, he died for us. that particular admission of guilt leads to a lot of anxiety with regard to the Jews who do not admit their guilt, who do not admit their sin. And the way Freud puts it is absolutely magnificent in its conciseness. Christians say, we have all killed him, which, if you notice, is actually the most universal statement that can be made. Yes, we are all Oedipus. We have all killed our father. We have all killed God. We have all killed him. But we, Freud continues to account for what appears at this point to be anti-Semitism and the difference between Judaism and Christianity. We appear to be completely within the realm of religion, except anti-Semitism may or may not belong. We have all killed him, but we who admit it, we are innocent. Implied, of course, is you Jews who do not admit it cannot, of course, be innocent. You have not confessed. You have not confessed your crime. You have not avowed your crime, and therefore you are a murderer. Freud goes even further and says that precisely because Jews do not acknowledge the crime, then they are still murderers, and therefore may be prone to do it again. And of course, Christian history is filled with claims by Christians that Jews are out to kill them, which is a somehow ironic history, but okay. It wouldn't be the first and only occasion where that's the case. Now, what I want to point out is that, in fact, as I already indicated, is that we have all killed him is again a summary of everything that Freud taught us about Oedipus, about the emergence of the human community in Totem and Taboo. Freud is not saying this is the Jews, yes? He's saying in Totem and Taboo, this is how humans are constituting themselves as a community. The point, by the way, is not whether or not Freud is right. The point is that Freud's argument is in fact not that uncommon. Yes, that violence is at the ground of the constitution of the community, that even the murder of a father would be at the ground of a community is not unique to Freud. The point, though, is again that this has nothing to do with religion. It has to do with any human development, any collective becoming as well. You may remember that at the beginning, Freud actually says that one of the reasons why he has a hard time beginning his book is because it is not easy to take away from a people the greatest of its sons. And it's an interesting moment. Yes, he's talking about Moses. He's going to argue that Moses is an Egyptian, not a Jew. So he's going to take Moses away from the Jews in order to claim that the Jews have killed Moses, not quite lingering with the fact that that Moses is in fact, in the entirety of the Jewish tradition, not one of the founders of Judaism, not one of the patriarchs. The three patriarchs are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses is not a patriarch. Freud seems to know that when he calls Moses one of the sons of the Jewish people, much as Freud himself identified as such. So, in a strange way, the question of Moses being or not being a Jew, kind of like Freud being or not being a Jew, is articulated around what we think today of as a biological notion. Is he a son or is he not a son? In the Hebrew introduction to Totem and Taboo, an introduction that Freud himself, of course, wrote in German since he did not know Hebrew, but one of the things that Freud says is that he does not identify, he does not belong to the Jewish people, he is not religious, he really has nothing of Jewishness, but he is a Jew after all. At that particular moment, Judaism doesn't seem to be a religion. It doesn't seem to be, in fact, anything identifiable. Freud says maybe one day science will be able to explain what this is about, what that sense is about. So you can see, though, that at the time he is writing, one great candidate to explain how is one a part of a group with no practicality to it, no law, no sense of belonging, nothing, that thing might very well be called biology. It might, in fact, very well be called race. So the Jews are a nation, or they are a religion. They're just a nation like every other. Oedipus, totem and taboo, the murder of the father. Or they are a religion, which Freud appears to be explaining as if it was special to the Jews. They killed Moses, therefore they are monotheistic. And race, which appears to determine everything kind of silently, as in Freud himself belongs to the Jewish people as one belongs to a race, by filiation, by biological connection. I wouldn't say that I have an answer to the way in which the three are connected. One of the things that I leave you with that puzzles me to no end is the universality of the narrative. Yes, again, Oedipus, of course. Feminists have long pointed out the problem with Freud's theory, which unfortunately has not necessarily changed the patriarchy under which we live, but nonetheless was important to point out. But the universality of the narrative, whereby the father, the dead father, is really the founding figure. And God as a father figure, of course, is another commonplace. But if I were to tell you of a religion, or of a polity, of a community, of a collective, that was founded by someone who was not a member of that collective, and who was murdered, then I assume that the first person you would think of would not be Oedipus, who did not found any community, and it would not be Moses. It would in fact be Jesus. Yes? Jesus, the Jew, is the founder of Christianity, something that Renan, as you now remember, was having troubles with. So basically, Moses is an Egyptian, Jesus was an Aryan. You can see suddenly a certain similarity to the kinds of argument that are made, but most importantly, Moses is Jesus. The community is founded by the sacrificial death of the father or the son, the greatest of the sons, the murder of the father. It is, in fact, the Christianity of Freud's argument that fascinates me, because it brings together race, nation, and religion under one short formula. We have all killed him. We have all come about as humans, as a human collective. That is the most universal Christian statement that could ever be made. But it's also what Freud describes as the most universal human statement that could be made. We have all killed him. We are all Oedipus. We are all murderers. But we who admit it, we are innocent. Yes? You could argue, in fact, I do and I did, you could argue that one of the most significant inventions of Christianity, according to Freud, is in fact the invention of innocent murder. We who have killed him, we have all killed him, but we who admit it are innocent. The community, whether it is a race, a nation, or a religion, and of course it is within a Christian context that those terms start to distinguish themselves from each other, either negatively or positively. Nation, positive; race, negative; religion, positive; nation, negative. The game is played with many possibilities, it is Christianity that actually comes about as the real object of Freud's reflection. And what's amazing is that for the most part, Moses and monotheism has not been read in those terms. That's it. The connection between race, nation, and religion is something that comes about within the Christian context, and in fact could be accounted for, if one reads Freud carefully, by the way in which he himself is struggling with the way in which those three, race, nation, religion, are articulated. But if we read Moses and monotheism only as an account of religion, and of monotheistic religion, then we are missing, in fact, the way the two other terms, the political, right, the religious and the political, and the biological. You have all of Foucault right there. Biopolitics, Agamben, etc. In their articulation and their dissociation comes about, it seems to me, much more clearly. Thank you. I spoke a little long.